All right, hi everyone. Welcome to our first live broadcast of the Champion Briefs News. I'm Isabella Paretti, and I'm a congressional debate and extemporaneous speaking expert, or at least have some expertise to provide for y'all. So today we're going to talk a little bit about what transpired the last week or so in the news. And what's really cool about this week's segment is that all of you are going to have the opportunity to ask me questions as the Google Hangout goes on, and hopefully I can answer them for you and provide you guys a little insight for maybe upcoming tournaments or just a greater understanding of what is going on. So without further ado, let's get started in some international issues. Last week we touched a little bit on the reshuffling of President Hollande and his own government, asking his Prime Minister, Mr. Valls, if he would be interested in potentially reshuffling the government to represent an ideology that's more similar to the one that Hollande is trying to put forth. And that is because Mr. Hollande, the President of France, has a terrible approval rating, just awful. In fact, The Guardian reported that it's around 17% as of late. So this reshuffling was hopefully going to be beneficial, and that was really already touched upon. But what's important here, and the recent developments, has been that the biggest reshuffling was the replacement of Mr. Montenberg by Emmanuel Macron, who is a former investment banker and an economic advisor, representing the key economic advisor for the Hollande administration. And Mr. Macron, while he does have phenomenal knowledge and expertise in the realm of all things finance and economics, does have a very different ideology to that of Mr. Hollande himself. And in fact, in 2012, when Mr. Hollande promised that he would slap out the 75% income tax rate, Mr. Macron said it's Cuba without the sun. And he's made many jabs to Mr. Hollande about turning to communism or too close to socialism, all of which were a little bit damaging, so it's interesting to see them working together. Something that we all need to be cognizant of for the scope of speech and debate is that going forward, this could spell out perhaps a more moderate way of dealing with economic issues, a potential change in the way that Mr. Hollande deals with maybe Angela Merkel or the European Central Bank, and for the 2017 upcoming elections, whether we'll have someone representative of Mr. Hollande's ideologies or more so of Mr. Macron, that more center-left that is pretty favorable in Europe in today's day and age, which is already reflected positively for Mr. Hollande's approval rating. So let's keep all that in mind. Furthermore, let's talk a little bit more about elections with regard to Brazil. Now, currently, the president, Dilma Rousseff, is fighting off to maintain her position as president of Brazil, but she's had a few roadblocks, and that's because we have our first debate just recently that occurred that put this dark horse, Marina Silva, ahead for the October 5th, 2014 election. Now, Marina Silva is in the Brazilian Socialist Party, whereas Ms. Rousseff is in more of a work and labor party. Now, the difference here is that Ms. Rousseff is more far left. It's sometimes considered like neo-Marxism, in fact, some of her policies, whereas Ms. Silva is a little bit more center-left. Her policies are a little bit more palatable, and definitely for the Brazilian people, because it's already reflected very tangibly in the numbers from the polls of this past week. Time magazine reported on September 1st of 2014 that recent polls put Silva ahead at 50% of the vote to Ms. Rousseff's 40%, and third place, Mr. Neves, who really isn't very much a threat to either of the women, is at around 34%. What's interesting, too, about Ms. Silva is that she wasn't intending to run for president of Brazil. She was intending to run as vice president, but when her running mate died a couple months ago in a plane crash, she did take on the ticket to, of course, promote the Brazilian Socialist Party. Something to keep in mind is, yes, they are both women, but more importantly, they're both environmentalists. And this is important because we're finding that both women are truly trying to make key changes in environmental policy. That is something that has bolstered both of their platforms, but of course there's some slight differences when it comes to economic and social issues. Of course, Ms. Rousseff is coming off a little bit of a precarious situation with the Brazilian people after the 2014 World Cup, and what happened there wasn't quite as much infrastructure, wasn't quite as much success as she had intended. So we need to be keeping a close eye on this election come October 5th. What this could mean potentially for Mercosur, the economic bloc of South America, what this could mean for the future of Brazil are questions we're going to have to keep in mind, because Brazil is very much the strongest power in South America, or at least one of the strongest, and as such, if they have a pretty significant shift in power from very far left to more of a centrist moderate policy, then that's going to affect the way that the windfall of marketing and, of course, financial endeavors takes hold, and just the perception of Brazil in a changing geopolitical landscape. Okay, so now we're going to talk about Iraq, which seems to be the issue that never really goes out of style as of late, unfortunately. In Iraq, President Obama just authorized another 350 troops, bringing the grand total of American troops on the ground to a little over 1,000. Now, of course, this isn't anywhere near the involvement that we had in Iraq back in 2003 or later, but it is that gradual incline that is making not only the GOP a little bit nervous, as much as they like to militarize, but really just the United States nervous. Obviously, we're keeping past Iraqi conflicts in the back of our head at all times. But he has stated multiple times, and this is reported by CNN on September 2nd of 2014, that the troops are largely for diplomatic purposes, stay on the ground more so as peacekeepers. And he did have some targeted airstrikes last month that he did authorize. But outside of that, the amount of tangible military force that has been exacted against Iraq and ISIS specifically hasn't been too terrible. So we have to be happy about that. But with the discussion of Iraq came a little bit of a debacle for President Obama when he came on the air last Thursday with a tan suit. Now, back in 2012, in a Vanity Fair article, he stated that he would only really wear dark-colored suits, and then he wore a tan suit, and Twitter kind of exploded with comments about this tan suit. But the reason that the tan suit is so important for debate, and not just because it's kind of funny that he was wearing this ill-fitting tan suit, is because it very much detracted from the crux of the issue, and he essentially was not declaring war, but declaring a more focused military effort, and all people could really focus on was that of the tan suit. So we absolutely need to look toward that. More so with regard to Iraq, ISIS, and the like, we found that some tragic occurrence happened just a couple of days ago with the beheading of Mr. Sotloff, an American journalist whose execution is actually very vaguely reminiscent of that of James Foley earlier this year, both of which were done with a man clad in all black. They're beheaded, they're shown very graphically, sent to the United States, and the executioner very explicitly blamed President Barack Obama for the execution of Mr. Sotloff, which it really was just a disgusting and graphic scene. He stated, "I'm back, Obama, and I'm back because of your arrogant foreign policy towards the Islamist State. Just as your missiles continue to strike our people, our knife will continue to strike the necks of your people." So all of that is just, you know, unfortunate news for President Obama, but really just unfortunate news for the United States, because it's very hard to see the difference in policies when they have not only an impact on the lives of Iraqi people, but also for American people. We have this unfortunate habit of really only paying any mind to things when they affect Americans, when they affect us. And now we're seeing the ramifications of our impact with Mr. Sotloff, with Mr. Foley, and with ISIS only continuing to gain strength. The New York Times reported on September 1st of 2014 that not only has ISIS affected the situation in Iraq, of course, the Sunni-dominated Anbar province has continuously gotten stronger, but ISIS has gained also a lot of power because of its link with Syria. And with that link to Syria, the increased militarization that's provided by the Syrian government with Bashar al-Assad has only allowed, of course, ISIS in Iraq to get stronger, but has also increased the volatility and exacerbated the situation in Syria itself, which, as the New York Times furthered just today, that the Syrian refugee count in countries like Jordan and Lebanon has actually breached 3 million people now, which is just a huge sum. So keep in mind the effects of ISIS are very much due to, yes, of course, the highly trained members of ISIS in Iraq, but also that extra aid through Bashar al-Assad, through Syria. And we're finding that ISIS has targeted not only those in Iraq, but in Syria as well, because there are still those remnants of that civil war. There's still things we need to be cognizant of there. So all in all, we're finding a situation that, to say the least, is fragile. And the United States definitely needs to take the allies that it has in the region, whether it be Turkey or Saudi Arabia, but ultimately it has to be done in a way that marries that of diplomatic and military action. easier said than done. So questions to be aware of are what the United States can be doing to effectively mitigate this conflict, what is happening going forward, and the like, which is going to take a lot of time to evaluate, to ascertain, but something we should all be thinking about. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Libya. This also was touched on in last week's broadcast. We found that the American ambassador to Libya, Mr. Dabashi, told the United Nations Security Council this past Wednesday that he always excluded civil war as a possibility until recently. The situation has changed. After the Arab Spring that began in 2011, Libya, what we had anticipated, had finally quashed its conflict, had turned a new leaf with eradicating Muammar Gaddafi, but now, unfortunately, things have taken a turn for the worse. The violence has increased, chaos has gone up, factions are backing rival prime ministers and assemblies. The United States says that Egypt and UAE, the United Arab Emirates, have carried out airstrikes against armed groups just to try to quell the violence that is occurring in the area. There are 11 missing aircrafts of the Libyan government. And more importantly than that, we're finding that increased death toll that the United Nations has officially asked the Libyan people and surrounding areas to keep tabs on. But Bloomberg reported on September 3rd of 2014 that although there has been this omnipresent violence, this chaos, this risk of a potential civil war, Libya is still exporting oil, which is one of its main sources of income, a huge valuable asset to that of the Libyan government, obviously the Libyan economy, but we do have to think about the fact that if this potential civil war does really end up materializing, what could that affect insofar as the oil production in Libya? Not only could that severely hinder economic stability and growth in Libya, but also to the hundreds of, thousands of people that that benefit from Libyan oil. If they don't have that source any longer, it could potentially create a little bit of a crisis. I'm not going to say something catastrophic, but definitely something that would not be beneficial to occur. So we need to be keeping a close eye on that, not only for the Libyan people, of course, we want them to be safe and happy, but also on a greater schema with regard to the economic influences of other nations as well. Okay, so now let's discuss Ukraine and Russia. That's definitely a topic that is a little bit complex, and I'm sure a lot of you have questions regarding these two nations, their difficulties in dealing with conflict mitigation and just having some form of peaceful discourse that is actually ameliorating the problem. The New York Times reported on September 4th of 2014 that President Putin unveiled a 7-point plan on Wednesday while he was visiting Mongolia. It was, in effect, coming after Russian troops were intervening in Ukraine this past week, to beat back the successful government offensive that they intended to have. But it could leave the country as a loose coalition that the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin, would be pretty happy with. Because if he can fragment the Ukrainian government in a way that leaves it to be conducive to him hopefully exploiting it to garner more power, then he's going to do so. So the timing of Mr. Putin's announcement was right around the same time in which Western leaders were discussing potentially renewing sanctions against Russia in its actions against Ukraine, and around the same time in which President Barack Obama made some of his harshest comments, very caustic, severe, against that of the Kremlin's armed intervention in Ukraine and NATO. And of course, this inflammatory diction and language and just general rhetoric isn't as efficacious as actual military action, but that is enough to spark some form of action in Vladimir Putin. He traditionally, when just looking back at his foreign and domestic policy, takes what other world leaders say very much to heart. Obviously, he's a target of a lot of criticism. That's what happens when you try to take over other countries. But while he doesn't stop when people tell him to, he does get very upset. So the 7-point plan was probably a measure of Mr. Putin to maybe deal with a lot of his critics. Of course, it's not completely something that is supported by the Western world, but it is something that we need to understand and hopefully see whether or not he truly adheres to, and whether or not that continued language by President Barack Obama will be implemented to get more action out of Mr. Putin that isn't so unilateral. Furthermore, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, has provided satellite evidence showing more than 1,000 Russian troops crossing over into the border of Ukraine, which does indeed violate its sovereignty. That was last week. Further, Russia has continuously denied sending weapons and military assets to the separatists in Ukraine, which are on the eastern side. The western side is the one that aligns more with the Western ideology, like holistic Western ideology, and that of Mr. Poroshenko. Some questions to look forward to in the future, in tournaments and bills, and some questions would be the upcoming October elections that Mr. Poroshenko had asked for. They're called snap elections that are hopefully going to create a parliament that is more representative of the policies that Mr. Poroshenko, or the Chocolate King, wants going forward. So let's keep a close eye on that election cycle, which is all coming up. Let's keep a close eye on Mr. Putin's 7-point plan, and let's also talk a little bit about what the United States is going to do insofar as intervening. So all of these are incredibly important. If you want to read a little bit more about the 7-point plan, there's a really great article in the Washington Post on August 29, 2014 that has a pretty good explanation of each point that I'm sure all of you could benefit from. Okay. So now let's take a shift over into the United States, domestic policy, domestic issues, and let's talk about a credit card scandal. Now, I don't know if many of you have credit cards. I know I just started college, so credit cards are becoming a little bit more real for me, but they are for many Americans as well, so not just me. The New York Times reported on September 2nd, 2014, that over the last few days that thousands of fresh credit and debit card numbers have surfaced on carding sites, which are websites that have stolen credit card data on them. These were done by Eastern European hackers. The location exactly of where those hackers are from outside of Eastern Europe is still unknown, and they're stolen account information from people in cities all the way in California up to New Hampshire, and they're charging as much as $50 per card, like that information. So it's a great business for them, but it's very much illegal. It's a huge issue for not just the people who have their identities, their card numbers stolen, but also for the United States. The Secret Service and the U.S. Department of Homeland Security have believed that it has affected more than 1,000 American retailers, in that the way that these hackers are receiving that information is hacking into databases of American retailers, like stores. And just recently, this big scandal, they've attributed a lot of that stolen credit card and debit card information to that of Home Depot. So the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, as indicated by that same New York Times article, is probably evaluating Home Depot and their servers, what they were able to do. But the important thing to be keeping in mind of is there is once again that issue of privacy and cybersecurity. All of this is something that creates that delicate balance between overall privacy and safety. Like, when is it too much of a breach of privacy to increase safety? And of course, to the regulations that many retailers have on their own databases to try to keep and maintain that safety, because this is just the first of many strings of occurrences in which credit card data has been stolen. This is definitely one of the biggest. But of course, this brings in more talk of cybersecurity that really hasn't been touched on as of late in Congress, or really by the Obama administration. Naturally, they have a lot to worry about, but as cybersecurity becomes a bigger and bigger part of our everyday world, it so too needs to be evaluated on a greater level in legislation. So let's keep that in mind, absolutely. All right, now a little bit of a touch on the Ebola crisis. Ebola is a disease, for all of you who do not know, that targets internal organs and creates really usually a fatal situation for the victim, in which they die anywhere from 6 to 10 days, or if they receive what now there is an experimental drug and vaccination that is provided that has been successful to an extent. If they receive that drug, then sometimes there's a chance of surviving. But because Ebola targets, at least right now, those who are in Western Africa and those who do not have as much resources insofar as general aid for medical issues, we find that it's been very hard to effectively quell that threat. So Bloomberg reported on September 3rd of 2014 that deaths from Ebola in West Africa have now surpassed 1,900, which is more than all previous other Ebola outbreaks combined, because of, yeah, once again, that lack of resources, lack of health workers, And because people are almost scared of the disease itself, they have a tendency to hide it when they have it. So when people realize that they have some Ebola symptoms, they hide them. The World Health Organization, WHO, declared it an international emergency, but the way that things work in the grand scope of international policy is because the United States is such a great hegemon and dictates a lot of medicinal, environmental, economic, military policy, that until it really starts affecting the United States, unfortunately, it's unlikely that there's going to be a very significant effort against fighting Ebola. There has been research, absolutely, but in terms of actually effectively ending the Ebola outbreak, or at least significantly reducing it, that does not seem likely at this time. It surfaced in Guinea in December. 3,500 people have been infected, and in 24 earlier outbreaks, including the first one reported in 1976, 1,590 people died. So now we're reaching around 10,000 total deaths from Ebola, which definitely means that there should be more money put into it. So questions for you guys when it comes to debate is what can be done, what can the United States do, whether or not the United States should put more money in. Of course, I would advocate yes, because it's really sad to see all these people dying, but in a realist, pragmatic sense, it's not so easy to say that we should just give all this money to those who are suffering. It's obviously what we would like to have. But of course, it's not always a reality. So I'm going to take this time really quickly to say, if all of you are watching and hopefully enjoying this broadcast, that you take a moment to tweet some questions out to me. I will be answering them at the end of the broadcast, so I want to make sure that I have a lot of cool things to talk about. If not, I'll be sorely disappointed. So I hope you guys do that. All right, well, moving on, let's discuss social policy in the United States, that of gay marriage. A Louisiana gay marriage ban was upheld by a federal judge who was appointed back in the Reagan administration, actually, Mr. Feldman, and the New York Times reported this actually just today, September 4th, and although the Supreme Court landmark case on gay marriage last year, the Windsor case, provided that, of course, gay marriage is essentially legalized, but to scope in that there is not going to be any form of discrimination against those who are gay and want to get married and the like. With DOMA, we're finding that even now the federal courts are not completely agreeing. So the exact opinion written in the U.S. District Court for Eastern District of Louisiana, well, this is a fragment of the 32-page opinion, was that Louisiana's laws and constitution are directly related to achieving marriage's historically preeminent purpose of linking children to their biological parents. So that is what Mr. Feldman, Judge Feldman, the Reagan appointee, stated in his opinion, basically making the argument that marriage is an establishment made to yield offspring, to have kids, and because biologically, obviously, those who are partaking in a gay marriage cannot actually create children, but of course can have children. There is a bit of a gray area that Louisiana has decided to take advantage of in upholding the gay marriage ban. So, of course, talking about controversial social issues is something that we like to stray away from in debate. It is definitely a topic that will be coming up. So discussing specifically the Louisiana gay marriage ban, or just maybe the hopes for more rights insofar as providing those who are gay rights, not only extending in marriage, but further, is always something that we need to be cognizant of. And we need to be evaluating that on hopefully the most unbiased and pragmatic sense that we can. So always make sure that when you're discussing things that are a little bit controversial, that you're not targeting it in so much of a pathos way, but very much in a logos way. That you're providing the facts, the legal backing, the precedents that were put forth, of course, the Supreme Court case, and try to argue it in that sense. Okay. So now let's discuss that of Eric Cantor. Now, if you remember, in the summer of 2014, arguably, at least one of my favorite domestic policy events was when Eric Cantor was not elected in the Republican Virginia primary again. He was elected back in 2000 for his seat, and and he was serving as majority leader, but Mr. Brandt ended up winning that election. An underpaid, underfunded economics professor at a university in Virginia ended up taking over for that GOP slot, very highly sought, and that just shocked not only the GOP, but really holistically Congress and all of those who pay attention to Congress at all. But on September 2nd of 2014, the LA Times reported that he is moving to Wall Street. So there are some perks for that. I mean, he always did love big business and definitely represented Wall Street well in his time as majority leader. He earned roughly $200,000 to be exact, around $193,400 as majority leader, and now he's going to be paid an annual base salary of $400,000 with his new job, Moelis and Company. Now, Moelis and Company is an organization that is focusing more on mergers and acquisition businesses, unlike larger Wall Street firms. When Mr. Moelis, who is the largest shareholder of the firm, he used to be an executive and used to work with UBS, which is a very large firm in Wall Street. He's turned something into more of a boutique firm, which is a little bit of a smaller set, once again focusing more so on mergers, a little bit smaller, but a huge point for Moelis and Company has definitely been reaching access. In 2013, GQ magazine published the 50 most powerful in Washington, and they had a key on top of why whoever was on the list was powerful, for what reason. And Eric Cantor had that of access to authority. As his position as majority leader, he had tremendous access to the biggest figureheads in Washington, and that's why he was such a powerful man himself. And although he's no longer majority leader, he still has that same access. He still has those connections, that network that he's established ever since 2000, and he definitely is going to be a invaluable asset to this firm, and probably is fairly happy working there, because since 2012 he raised approximately $1.4 million from financial firms and their employees, according to the Center of Responsive Politics, more than any other industry. So all these donors were going towards the GOP, going to super PACs, and he's definitely been able to harness that relationship and really take it to the bank, literally and figuratively. Unfortunately, he fell a little bit short when coming to his re-election, but now it looks like he's going to have a fairly lucrative career, continuously representing big business, and with that aforementioned network, probably still influence policy to an extent because of the people that he knows on Capitol Hill. So we need to talk just when we're looking to that of Eric Cantor, what his continued effect will be in Washington, even now that he doesn't have an elected position. So questions that could come up ranging in like what he will be doing for Moelis & Co., how he could shape Wall Street, but most importantly, what this means for the GOP and still having that link to big business, to Wall Street, to firms and the like, and what he can be doing for those big businesses in Washington. All right, so now let's look again to President Barack Obama. We talked a little bit about him because, of course, it's kind of inevitable that his name will come up when talking about foreign policy, naturally. He is really unpopular right now. He's suffering a bit of a hard time when it comes to yielding a positive approval rating throughout the United States, even in California, which is historically a very blue state outside of Arnold Schwarzenegger. We found that he is the lowest California approval rating for Democrats in over 2 decades, which is around 42%. And that was reported by Politico on September 1st of 2014. So poor President Obama. But more so than the fact that he doesn't exactly have a favorable perception of that of the American people, there was a bit of a kind of jab that he has taken to hold his own as a strong leader outside of the realm of foreign policy, outside of the traditional way in which he just carries himself, but in really taking a jab against the GOP and trying to say that although there have been some roadblocks in his administration, he's doing all he can, but he was pointing fingers. So in his September 1st, 2014, his Labor Day, Politico reported about his Labor Day speech. He stated, and I think that this is probably the most important quotation from the speech, well, of course, outside of the ones discussing the Iraqi conflict and all of that, I mean, in terms of just the rhetoric itself. Most of the policies I'm talking about have 2 things in common. They're going to help more working families get ahead, and the Republicans who run our Congress oppose almost all of them. So the two things in common are that the Republicans in Congress hate them, and that they are meant to help the working families, which is something that has transcended all of his years in office, that he's had ever since campaigning before the 2008 election change we can believe in. He's always been an advocate for that working class, but he is pointing fingers to the Republicans in Congress for continuously shooting down his ideas, for saying no, for providing opposition even when they agree. And that has been an attack that has been pretty ubiquitous, but it's very hard not to give any worth to that assertion, because we're finding that with such gridlock in Congress, it really is hard not to blame, at least to an extent, the GOP for some of the shortcomings, but then at the same time we do need to blame some of the Democratic representatives in Congress, because they're unwilling to compromise to the GOP. We're finding one of the least effective Congresses of all time, once again a terrible approval rating that seems to be never changing, but something to be aware of is how we can get Congress moving forward, how we can stop this gridlock, how can President Obama still make positive change with perhaps not moving toward Congress. And these are all questions that, of course, have constitutional answers, but also ones that are going to require some time to evaluate, because I'm sure as much as we, as debaters, and are all asking ourselves, so too is the Obama administration, or his cabinet, or his advisors, or his chief of staff asking themselves. So coming up for the 2014 midterm elections, it'll be interesting to see if there's a reshuffling in the House or in the Senate, and how that will in turn affect the way that Congress runs. But I think that one thing that we just need to bear in mind with all of this political inefficacy, is that it turns to a lack of political action taken by the people. So I'm going to go into a slight rant and saying that make sure all of you, once you turn 18, vote, because in times, historically even, where Congress is not really effective, we found that that people are more unwilling to get out there and vote, to be more passionate about policies themselves. Okay, so now yet another issue on the domestic front is that of Mr. McDonnell of Virginia. He's the former governor of Virginia, and his wife, Maureen. They were both convicted today, September 4th of 2014, of corruption in the federal court after a trial that halted the political ascent of this one-time Republican star. That was the lead of the article. And he really was a star. He was a GOP darling, and the fact that he has now been convicted in federal court for corruption is just a huge blow, of course, to Mr. McDonnell himself, but also to the GOP, because in backing someone who has now kind of a shoddy reputation, it doesn't really bode well for the way that the GOP is universally perceived, and we already saw that in the past with that lack of credibility that the GOP is trying to hold on to. He was pronounced guilty on 11 counts of conspiracy, bribery, and extortion, all the good ones, and his wife as well was convicted on 9 counts. They both were very seemingly distraught in the courtroom. Their 5 adult children sitting behind them were sobbing. It was just a terrible day for the McDonnell family, but also a terrible day for the Republican Party, because once again, Mr. McDonnell really was a sweetheart, was a star, was a darling, and now he's just not representing the party in the way that they need to be represented for such an important cycle, such an important midterm election. They are facing years in prison. They did have some lesser charges that were dropped, but the ultimate thing here to be looking toward is that politicians really are vulnerable. When there is a threat of a politician being corrupt, oftentimes we will, especially from watching shows like House of Cards, we're like, oh, there's really not going to be any implication, but there truly is. If there's one thing that at least I have some faith, and all of you should have faith in too, is that when it comes to corruption, the United States, when juxtaposed against other nations, has a pretty good handle on it. But we do have to ask ourselves, too, what this means to the GOP going forward. Is this going to be a huge blow to the GOP, or is this going to blow over? Of course, these are things that we can tell with time. We can't be sure. But also with corruption going forward. Of course, in the end, this was nipped in the bud, but can we have more corruption, or rather anti-corruption techniques put in place in the government to hopefully curb future future corruption issues from happening in the future. So that's that with regard to Mr. McDonnell. So let's see if you guys have any questions for me to answer. I want to make sure that I can have all of that taken care of. Okay, so let's see. Hold on. I think we have something from @Lacey_Larson. Okay, let's see. Let me read that. Okay, hold on. Okay, all right. Lacey asks, what can Iraq's changing leadership do to combat ISIS? Should Iran be a concern or an ally? Okay, well, that's a really cool question. I'm glad you brought it up. Okay, so this is kind of multifaceted in that, okay, of course, you talked first about Iraq. Now, they have a new prime minister who, as compared to Mr. Maliki, is considerably more moderate. But moderate compared to Maliki is still pretty intense in that although he is not so adamantly anti-Sunni, the Sunnis living in the Anbar province, the Sunnis that have been militarized within ISIS, he still, of course, is a Shiite at heart and does have that kind of negative view of the Sunni people in Iraq, and still will have that negative view in dealing with ISIS. Of course, that's a given. But it could potentially lead to a more cohesive government, rather, in that it could be more effective. That more moderate way of thinking isn't going to solve all of the problems, but even just in dealing with discourse among the government, we can allow for greater efficacy if there is a calmer person at the helm. But it's still going to need a lot of time and effort insofar as mitigating a very weak and ineffective Iraqi army, which actually stems back from the 2003 United States invasion in Iraq, in which when the United States troops came in, the Iraqi military was deemed practically defunct, and those who were in the Iraqi military are now some of the biggest power players in ISIS today because they needed a job, they needed a cause, and they took towards Islamist extremism. It's an unfortunate reality. But as the Washington Post explained for you, Lacey, on June 22nd of 2014, U.S. officials have said that before major Western aid came, the Iraqi army faced a psychological collapse from desertions in the face of defeat by ISIS. So that's just like this ongoing view of the Iraqi military as being kind of just subpar compared to that of ISIS. They are continuously viewing themselves as lesser. I love telling the story. Well, I don't love it. It's just kind of the reality in which there were roughly 300 members of ISIS coming against a 3,000 group of Iraqi militants, and those 3,000 Iraqi militants ended up fleeing the scene because they were so afraid of the 300 ISIS members who were coming at them for some form of military action there. So that's definitely something that is going to be more effective in dealing with the ISIS situation, not so much the new prime minister replacing Mr. Maliki. So although it will be a step in the right direction, any immediate gratification is pretty unlikely. Okay. And as far as Iran being a concern or an ally, let's see. Should Iran be a concern or an ally? Oh, hold on, sorry. Well, I definitely think that that's more so. Okay, so for the United States, Iran should definitely be something that's always kept on our radar. As far as being like an overwhelming concern, I'm generally in the school of thought that they're not like an overwhelming thing to be aware of. And of course, ISIS takes the precedent over Iran as being the biggest Middle Eastern issue that the United States is trying to keep tabs on. Okay, so let's look toward our next question. Let's see. Okay. All right. From @Mike Hunchowski, let's see. What should be the U.S. strategy to deal with ISIS? All right. So naturally, I have to know a fair amount about ISIS, but at the end of the day, I'm not a policymaker. I cannot say the exact policy that would be the most effective in dealing with ISIS. But I can say that we do need increased gravity placed on the ISIS situation and increased speed in dealing with ISIS. There's a lot of red tape and bureaucracy coming up with effective foreign policy, especially one that has such a ramification on the United States. We saw this with the execution of Mr. Sotloff, that there is going to be there is going to be a reaction for everything that we do in Iraq. But there could be some cool ways to evaluate this in helping out the Iraqi military, like I mentioned, that is very weak in potentially having the United States troops very much going into Iraq and doing something reminiscent in 2003 and going in and putting troops on the ground more so than the roughly 1,000 that are there now, or even including airstrikes. There's the question always whether or not airstrikes are truly effective. There were some airstrikes back in in early August that somewhat quashed the violence in the area, but ultimately are not the kind of just the panacea, like the end-all be-all of solving the ISIS situation. But I think it'd be a cool thing for all of you doing Congress to do is to look at some cool ideas with regard to ISIS in engaging the Arab League to combat ISIS, engaging more of the allies in the region and not making it such a unilateral United States kind of thing to do, or even to look to the Libyan intervention in which the United Arab Emirates and Egypt intervened there, and how that was somewhat effective in dealing with it because there was a bit of a coalition instead of just the United States taking force. But then, of course, we need to be evaluating whether or not the United States getting too involved could leave Iraq in a similar situation to what happened when we initially were involved in 2003, in which we very much crippled the strength or potential strength of an Iraqi government because we had effectively taken it over and very much used like the government there as just kind of our puppets as we fed them things to say, things to do, and implementing foreign and domestic policy. All things to keep in mind. So there are multiple options that we can use. I generally think that diplomacy needs to always be done first, but that is a little bit of an idealistic approach. There should always be, I think, a little bit of an aspect of military involvement when a crisis like this one has gotten to be so bad as it is now. So there you go, at Mike Hunchowski. But let's look on to the next question. Let's see. Oh, once again, at Lacey Larson. How is NATO changing with the conflict in Ukraine? Okay, so a cool article by the BBC on September 4th today, 2014. There were leaders of NATO that explicitly said that they stood with Ukraine in the face of Russian destabilizing influences. So ultimately, we're finding that NATO is very much at the helm of the Ukrainian conflict in their support of Ukraine. So they're kind of unabashedly supporting Ukraine at this point. Back in, I think it was 2009, in a convention in which Russia, Ukraine, and NATO were all involved, it was meant to just be kind of a convention in which they delegated, like they just discussed peace, they discussed past policies. It was kind of just like a shake hands, photo op kind of opportunity. NATO argued that perhaps providing Ukraine with membership in NATO would be beneficial, which created a huge uproar by Russia, ended up leading to the Russian invasion of Georgia in retaliation, and just had terrible consequences. But at this point, we've kind of gone off the cliff insofar as NATO's support of Ukraine. So at this point, NATO doesn't really have anything to fear when it comes to supporting Ukraine, and they'll continue to support Ukraine. Russia has taken on a mind of its own. Vladimir Putin seems to be unstoppable. So their support of Ukraine now will be more tangible, but also more beneficial. They'll take more military action to actually ameliorating the conflict. But NATO definitely wants Russia to step back from confrontation, to take the path of peace. NATO has always advocated for the more diplomatic approach. Whether or not Russia will follow suit in that is up to time to tell, but NATO definitely wants to bolster Ukraine militarily and even politically by providing them for some solace in their capital cities and dealing with Poroshenko and trying to shield Western Ukraine from Russian intervention or involvement so that they can be as strong as humanly possible to rebuff that of the efforts of Vladimir Putin and Russia. But NATO's role after 2001, 9/11, dealing with threats from Middle East and terrorism, they had kind of a traditional approach that was more so like the Cold War, but now they're looking more towards global security. So NATO has definitely increased its power over the years. definitely allowed for itself to grow, to expand, but to take a very strong approach when supporting any nation, and in this case it's Ukraine. So the change here is that as the conflict gets worse, the support of NATO gets better. So that's a plus. But let's look on to our next question. Let's see. All right. I appreciate all of you guys sending in awesome tweets. I really do love answering them. Let's see. At that one extemper, what is the future of Hong Kong and its want for democracy? Okay, so Hong Kong is a little bit of a different way of dealing with economic and political policy, because it's a special economic zone and it deals with its own domain. Obviously, it's still under the totality of the Chinese authority, like the Chinese government's authority, but it does operate a little bit differently. The Economist reported that on August 31st, China announced its first elections in Hong Kong, and they called it a significant leap forward insofar as democracy and its change. And I'm sure that's probably what you're referring to in its seeking out of democracy. But Hong Kong is still a little apprehensive, because even though China announced these elections, there is just that overwhelming fear that the elections are going to be rigged. We're finding that they're only allowing for communists to run, and it's pretty unlikely that Hong Kong, unfortunately, is going to secure true democracy under Chinese control. Because even though they're allowed some leeway in dealing with its own politics and economics, we have to keep in mind that it's still a part of China. It's still, unfortunately, a part of that Chinese way of government function in which, although there are many subsets for splitting up political power, it's still controlled by the CCP, the Communist Party. It's likely that there could be protests, that there could be overwhelming complaints, and whether that's done in a more peaceful way or a more violent way, only time will tell. So the future doesn't really seem too bright. We can only hope that with potential protest or with voiced opinions that they are unhappy with this election system, that maybe it could change. But it's unfortunately unlikely. So let's see. Let's move on to our next question. All right. Hold on. Gotta read. Okay. All right, we'll have a little technical difficulties. In the meantime, your Twitter handle, that one extemper, is very, very nice. I appreciate your dedication to the extent that you would even allow your Twitter to become a part of what you love. Obviously, I did extemporaneous speaking, and I love Congress, for all of you people watching Congress, but extemp definitely is pretty cool. I did not have a Twitter handle, though, that included extemp in the name, and you did have a cool question. I love talking about Asia, but not just the traditional Chinese, is China like a threat to the United States' hegemony or authority, but very specifically with Hong Kong and its desire for democracy. So I can only say good things about that. When picking questions, or even when picking sides or arguments in Congress, it's always awesome if you can pick something that's a little bit off the beaten path, off the traditional selected questions or arguments, and you can really make it your own. I found that to be such a helpful way in getting ahead in tournaments, and also in broadening my own interpretation of issues. So in talking about Hong Kong, like a part of China, instead of talking about holistically like Chinese democracy, is so great. So I definitely commend you for that effort, at least in that regard. We have to find that when dealing with democracy in China, there is a little bit of a difference, once again, in the special economic zones, like in Hong Kong, because Hong Kong serves as a bit of a hub for a more globalized economic and political situation. So, of course, there is a pretty significant difference in that of looking into like smaller provinces and looking toward really any of Western China that is largely agrarian in nature. But it is interesting to keep tabs on it as well, because it's kind of exciting to see what these kind of subsets in China can do. Right now, it seems that they're still very much at the control of the Chinese government, but over time, we have to keep in mind that we're always in a changing geopolitical landscape, and it's amazing how much things really could change if we give it a little bit of time. So when you say that they're seeking out democracy, yeah, absolutely, and it's because the people there are cognizant of what democracy can really do for expanding economic interests. But we also need to find that with that desire will hopefully come some form of change. In China in the past, all efforts to create change, like Tiananmen Square and the like, were kind of just shut down by the Chinese government, and now looking at past protests is not even something that's accessible in the library or on the internet. When you try to look up Tiananmen Square and Tiananmen protests, you'd be unsuccessful if you lived in China. But times are changing, and I think that there could be in the future, maybe not in the next year, maybe not in the next 5 years, but maybe in the next 20 years. This is like an optimistic approach, that there really could be a change. Okay, so now let's look on to our next question from Ryan Kennedy. Okay, I joined a little late, but I'm curious of your take on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and any possible reactions from the USFG. Okay, all right, so let's see. All right. Okay, well, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, of course, is one that has been going on since 1948, when Israel was established as a state. Unfortunately, it seems that violence and conflict are just a day in the life for the Israeli people. And as of late, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has become even more significant after the kidnapping of 3 Israeli teenagers by a local Palestinian clan that included Hamas, which is an extremist militant group. So learn a little bit more about Hamas. Sorry, brief side note, I would look up the Council on Foreign Relations Backgrounders. They published an amazing backgrounder on Hamas that you can learn more about that group with. Anyway, so these 3 Israeli teenagers were kidnapped by the Palestinian clan, including Hamas operatives, but there is no direct link that the main Hamas leadership knew about this. So it does make the claim, the Israeli claim, that Hamas staged these kidnappings, that Hamas knew about it, that it was Hamas's fault, all a little bit up in the air. And that's why I think the international community in the United States haven't taken a very staunch approach and support of Israel's claims against Hamas, because there isn't any overwhelmingly conclusive evidence about that. But looking at the totality of the Israel-Palestinian conflict, unfortunately, it looks like the future is going to be more of the same. It looks grim. We found that although there was a ceasefire, the 9th ceasefire of the year, done just last week between Israel and Palestine, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's going to be a long-standing ceasefire, or that there will be somehow an end to the conflict, to the violence that's going on in the region. As long as Israel continues its settlements, continues expanding territory, that ceasefire isn't going to last, and this is cannot be equated to that of actual progress in the region. Of course, the use of violence by Hamas, the use of violence by Israel, the retaliation always is violence versus never really taken a diplomatic approach, is only going to further exacerbate that situation, because if both sides are more willing to take on military approaches before they come down and sit at a table, shake hands, and really discuss the issues, and can discuss what can be done without even a moderator there, like the United States stepping in a meeting between 2 leaders, then the future cannot actually be changed. Because we found that there's been, at least in the Middle East, kind of a shift in power pretty holistically. And while a large amount of that can be attributed to the Arab Spring, there was some means of diplomatic, of more peaceful methods of actually changing the way a country functions. Like we see in countries like Libya that weren't able to sit down at the table and really make up a conclusive diplomatic plan, they weren't as successful. In countries that were able to eradicate autocratic leaders and take a little bit of a more diplomatic approach, there was that increased success. So, of course, diplomacy and military involvement need to go hand in hand. And for the case of Israel and Palestine, perhaps a little bit more diplomacy could definitely benefit them. The New Yorker published an article actually on September 1st of 2014 called Friends of Israel, about the lobbying group and its role encouraging U.S. support for Israel, how that role could be changing. I definitely think that the New Yorker is a great way to look at political issues in a new light, because while this is obviously kind of like a cutting-edge article talking about the changing support for Israel and the United States, which seem to be always a continued support of the United States and Israel are like kind of peanut butter and jelly that occasionally like get a little messed up but still try to stick together. So always look to the New Yorker for a more, not controversial, but a little bit more imaginative and innovative way of looking at problems. I also really like the Borowitz report, which is usually for domestic policy, and getting a little bit of satire in there instead of saying America's finest news source, The Onion. So that could be kind of fun. So in that regard, unfortunately, my take on the Israel-Palestinian conflict, this is kind of a long-winded way of saying it, is that of a bad situation. So with that, I really appreciate your question. I really appreciate all of you watching. You can look at all of our amazing videos and resources for congressional debate and extemporaneous speaking if you look at championbriefs.com. It is fantastic. Have a great rest of all of your night. I really appreciate you watching. I'm Isabella Paretti, and that's the news.